Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday the 10th of May, and under normal circumstances, I would have led today a very brief church service in Haxby and Wigginton as we enter the third day of our Scarecrow Festival, and we would have had little to complain about. 2 days of beautiful sunshine and warm weather. Today, not so much, but it would have been a good weekend, and it's probably still been a good weekend, just quite differently so. Or maybe not such a good weekend, depending on what people's experience of this time has been. Today's Gospel reading set for this Sunday is particularly poignant this morning, mostly because I used it on Wednesday at the crematorium in a 10-minute service for a woman who died, who had we been able to celebrate her life in normal circumstances, I'm sure could have had several hundred people coming to pay tribute to a quite remarkable life. And her family chose these words, which are part of our Methodist funeral service, or one of the options. They're from John chapter 14. John's Gospel is quite different to the other three Gospels, the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. In John's Gospel there are a number of places where the writing is unique and the storytelling is not found elsewhere. And a quarter, in terms of the chapters, a quarter of John's Gospel takes place in the room where the Last Supper has taken place. We don't really hear the story of the Last Supper in the same way. Jesus washes the disciples' feet in John's Gospel. But from chapter 13 to the end of chapter 17, so 5 full chapters, we have the story of the washing of the disciples' feet, Judas leaving to go and betray Jesus, and then Jesus entering into an extended set of teaching about the nature of God and the nature of God's kingdom and the centrality of love in in the work the disciples need to do in building the opportunity for people to experience God in a whole new way. It's excuse me. It's quite practical. It's very philosophical, and in it he's also trying to give them some reassurance about what will happen to them, both in their lives and beyond. So these words from chapter 14, just the first 6. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know the way. We do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on you do know him and have seen him. So what we normally do with that passage is we narrow it down into a conversation about heaven and the afterlife and the necessity of coming to faith in Jesus Christ as a kind of entry point into that. And I guess you can easily read those things into it straight off. But that passage is about much deeper things as well. It's about the reassurance given to the disciples that their lives are lived towards a meaningful end. And that I mean, most crucially in that last sentence, Jesus says to them, from now on you have seen the Father. You have known the Father. You have been up close and personal with God because you've been up close and personal with me. A radically new and frankly, I'm sure, a terrifying idea for some of those who had their faith as good Jewish men and women mediated from a distance through temple worship and the representation of a priest. But Jesus says, you know God because you know me. You've come close to God because you've been close to me. God is not hidden from you in some abstract set of teachings because you've seen God personally, and God has eaten with you and laughed with you and shared your life. And so there isn't some great mystery to the fact of God's presence in your life. But there's lots to learn. Of course, Thomas pops up, good old Thomas. How can we know the way? We don't know where you're going. And Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Which is, for some, a kind of strong line in the sand. You step over this line, and then then you're on the right side of it. But if you don't get anywhere near. In a sense, Jesus is the bouncer at the door. Jesus is the checker of the tickets. Jesus is the kind of, I don't want to say security detail, but Jesus is the great key that unlocks everything of God, without which there is nothing of God in your life. I'm not sure about that. I think that reduces God quite a lot in our understanding. But maybe the clue is in what follows, in that Jesus says, in order to experience the intimacy of God, the personal of God, the character of God, just the deep knowing that God is with you in your daily life and not abstract and hidden from you, you need only look at me. You have known that. You have seen that. You have experienced that. So now you know it. Today I reflect on VE Day, reflect on a government announcement that comes to us later from the Prime Minister about what lies ahead, reflect on all kinds of things that are about narrative, are about the way we tell ourselves the story of our lives, and the voices we give the most platform to in each of our lives and in our life together. So I perhaps rather grandly want to call myself a follower of Jesus. A follower of Jesus. I'm not sure what the word Christian always means, because that has been tied up in kind of belief and understanding. But when I look at and read the Gospels, and I see the incredibly powerful practical social teaching of Jesus in terms of the way we deal with each other as neighbors, when I read the Gospels and you encounter the unequivocal words that are about love of enemies and forgiveness and the hard work of freedom in every part of our lives, not some kind of sentimental niceness or sort of soppy wishfulness, but a dedicated, creative invitation to work hard at becoming open and warm and welcoming, and at the same time honest and real and challenging and authentic. If that's what following Jesus means, I'm having a go. I remember Dallas Willard, who was a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California, a committed Christ-following man himself, who's written some really, really wonderful books. I remember hearing him once say that he once walked out of a lecture theatre, and one of his students followed him out into the corridor and said to him, "Excuse me, Professor Willard, can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Sure, what do you want to know?" And the student, a little bit puzzled at this incredibly intelligent, philosophical mind, having the faith that he did, said to him, "Why do you follow Jesus?" And Dallas Willard's response was, "Well, who else did you have in mind?" And he said that humbly, and I believe he meant it well. It wasn't there was no arrogance in his response, but it was a good question. Who else did you have in mind? I have to say this carefully, but I'm occasionally surprised when I bump into people I know, love, and respect, who've bought newspapers I wouldn't buy, because they are they are quite demonstrably fed by agendas of racism and lack of respect. We give all kinds of people, places, and things voices in our lives that aren't good places to do our following in, unless we choose to follow those agendas that speak of separating and protecting and a pride in ourselves that is unhealthy, that is. I'm struggling a bit this morning. Leaves us feeling a little bit smug and special. It's quite interesting, been quite interesting these last few days to see how different countries across Europe were celebrating or remembering, marking is the best word, the 8th of May when hostilities in Europe ended, with the obvious proviso that in other places in the Pacific and in Asia and elsewhere, life was still deeply full of violent conflict, and that on the horizon across Eastern Europe was a kind of Stalinist communism that was very destructive for many people. But the tone taken by different nations and different places is quite telling in how different they are. I for a long time have struggled with the way that the United Kingdom tells itself the story of its place in especially the Second World War. We talk about the Allies, and it just sounds like the subtext is that we were out in front with some gang members coming along behind. And our languages of victory. It strikes me, and again, just listening to some of those commenting on the time, those historians who tell the story perhaps a little more honestly or a little more realistically, that the 8th of May was a day of understandably wild relief, but that very few people were in any doubt that some of the hardest times, not so much in terms of violence, but in terms of aftermath and work to do, and the wounds that were left in society by such a conflict, that those things were very real and just around the corner. Who do you follow? Where do you get your news? Who do you listen to? Whose opinion shapes yours? Whose thoughts about life, faith, God, men, women, homosexuality, foreigners, the craziness of the deeply real kind of class consciousness of this country's life? Who do you follow? Who tells you who helps you to shape your thinking, to perhaps in the rest of that passage in John's Gospel from chapter 14 onwards through 15, 16, 17, to become radically, vulnerably, wonderfully open to a world that is wonderful but hard, and a world that is asking of you and me to lay down our lives, perhaps not so dramatically and spectacularly as we think that really means, but to form a society together, a culture, a way of life, a way of being, a way of understanding ourselves, to do that in such a way that we are all the better for it, because we are less protected, we are less defended, we are less, our walls are smaller, our fences are lower. So today our Prime Minister will make an announcement about the next couple of weeks in our lives here, and for good or ill, Boris Johnson is our Prime Minister. And part of the way that Boris Johnson gets talked about so often is this kind of great personality, I wonder how he will be remembered when his time has come to an end as Prime Minister. We look back a little bit into our past and see someone like Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, who in our minds, because of the way that the press told us about him most of the time, had a bit of a lazy eyelid and was a bit boring, or very boring. Maybe so. But Gordon Brown, I think uniquely amongst the Prime Ministers we've had in all the time I've lived in the UK, and I think some time before, championed out of the depths of his own quite serious following of Jesus, championed our place and our responsibility within the global economy, within the global aid system, within the global development system, who fought and fought and fought for us to be more and more generous, more and more open, and to protect against any onslaught, even when it came to the financial crash of 2008. Fought to preserve that part of us that we give away. And whatever your feelings are about Gordon Brown, because the other obvious thing is, well, he and Tony Blair had quite a lot of conflict, didn't they? And of course our tabloids love that. Journalists love that. Unresolved conflict. Ooh, whispers and rumours, rather than substance and track record. I hope I don't sound grumpy this morning. I'm not. But as we think about the moment we're in, and as we ask where it leads, I do want to ask you, who do you follow? And I'm not asking you, do you believe in Jesus? Although that is there, I don't mind asking you that question, or you feeling that I've asked it, because I think it's an important question. And if the answer is no to Jesus, then I want to, add on Dallas Willard's question. Well, who else did you have in mind? Who are the voices? Who are the people? Who are the influencers? What's the term? It's influencers, isn't it? Shows how up to date I am. Who are the people who shape your thinking? Where are the places you go for your news? With what degree of trust or skepticism do you simply absorb what comes your way? How do you make decisions about what to believe and what not to believe? Who tells you what is right and good and just? Who tells you what is responsible and mature and adult? Those are important questions for all of us. Whoever we are and whatever we believe and whatever we do with our time, our money, our gifts, our talents, our whatever our outlook is in the world. Who do you follow? Who do you follow? So taken on its own, John 14, those first few verses, seem to quite simply trot out a kind of doctrine of heaven and a roadmap to get there. This is what you need to not worry about. Don't worry about what will happen after you die, because I'll look after you. I'll make sure you have a comfy place to be. And you know how to get there because you know me and you've loved me and you've accepted me, so therefore your ticket is secure. Very facile, two-dimensional, shallow reading of a little passage that sits within a big narrative through the whole of John 13, which begins with the washing of the disciples' feet, which is something I talked about over the Easter weekend on Good Friday. If you want to go back and refresh your mind, or if you haven't listened to it and you have nothing else to do. Begins with this enormously intimate act. A God who is personally involved in the dirt of life. And then passes through this little passage in 14 into chapters 15, 16 and 17, which are quite kind of philosophical and erudite in all kinds of ways, but they have deep truths within them about the kinds of people we are being asked to be as followers of Jesus, maybe just as human beings, because there isn't a huge amount in there that is about believing in God, but there is a lot that is about looking to the example of God and the character of God and the nature of God, and Jesus reflecting all of that through that verse that says, if you've met me, you've met God, you've seen God, you know God's passion, you know God's sense of humor, you know God's desires, you know God's love of the stranger, you know these things, you know God, and you have been welcomed in the presence of God. Who do you follow? Who do you follow? And why? I think that's a good question for all of us. See, I try to be a follower of Jesus. I don't get it right a lot of the time. I surround myself with comfort. I convince myself of things that are really important when in fact I read the Gospels and think, no, Rory, you should be doing, thinking, spending yourself in another direction. Who do you follow? I'll leave that with you today. Loving God, thank you for the challenge to listen to other voices, not just the voices we agree with, but the voices that speak powerfully into our lives about who we might yet be. And we thank you for these words and ask that you would help us to take them to heart, both that we can intimately know you and that we can discover something of your character, your life, your heart, your hope for the world in the words and the actions of Jesus. And if we're not sure about Jesus, would you help us to be sure about love, sure about the things that keep us loving and make us more loving, and that ultimately set us all free. And we pray for our government, who today will announce how they intend to lead us into the future, even if that just means the next 3 weeks. Amen.